Yuji Itadori now has two completely different curse techniques. He's a blood manipulator like his brother Choso, and he has Shrine like Ryomen Sukuna. But Yuji has never pushed both of these techniques to their true potential. Imagine seeing Itadori using flowing red scale like his brother Choso and Kamo, or even heating up the divine flame like Sukuna himself. There are obvious reasons behind why Itadori doesn't or can't perform these abilities and why we never see him use them on screen, but that's not really the point of today's video. It's more about the abilities that Yuji Itadori's techniques have the capacity to perform, but Yuji himself doesn't activate them for whatever reason. Starting off with Yuji's curse technique Shrine, this technique was inherited but not like normal circumstances. After Sukuna's incarnation and takeover, he began using the full extent of his jujutsu but within Itadori. Every cleave and dismantle used by Sukuna eventually became ingrained as muscle memory. After all, Sukuna not only used special grade curse techniques but also his cursed energy manipulation in general. That's also the reason behind why Itadori was able to develop so rapidly. His body was already given special grade experience after each incarnation. Itadori has mainly been using dismantle and not really much else was ever explicitly mentioned. During the Shinjuku Showdown and Awakening Shrine, Yuji nearly immediately discovered his newly manifested technique. Both himself and Sukuna have the same curse technique, but each follow two very different interpretations. Techniques that have been handed down through generations can also awaken with completely different forms. Itadori Shrine and Sukuna Shrine seem different, but they share the same fundamental aspect, that is they cut things but really deep. Itadori Shrine manifests itself with scissors and guidelines, while Sukuna's are completely invisible and don't attack anywhere near the soul like Itadori. Narratively, this was probably more intentional than you might think. Yuji Itadori is completely different from Ryomen Sukuna, and Shrine makes that clear. While Sukuna can dismantle his opponents without caring for the environment or those within his path, Yuji's follow these drawn out guidelines with scissors. Scissors themselves are designed to be these forms of controlled and precise cuts rather than ripping through objects like Sukuna's version of dismantle. Yuji's desire to help people and the world around him likely means that he wouldn't enjoy nearly aimlessly directing slashes like Sukuna. Personality plays a big part in your curse technique's interpretation, so Yuji's caring and nurturing attitude towards changing the world likely created this version of Shrine. Overall, Sukuna makes it pretty clear. Itadori Shrine has its own interpretation, but fundamentally it seems to remain the same. When it comes down to just the techniques that Itadori has used before, he might not have performed the world-cutting slash, but he can definitely be found on Poly AI. Poly AI lets you bring your own character and ideas to life. You can create a custom chatbot, decide its personality, write a backstory, and have full conversations that evolve based on how you interact. Poly AI is already used by millions around the world, with over 10 million downloads. Whether you're into creating anime characters or something completely original, Poly AI makes it very easy to craft unique chatbots that feel like your own. You can even chat with characters others have created, offering endless possibilities. There's so many characters on this app that it honestly feels unlimited. By using my exclusive code, you're gonna unlock premium features that enhance your chatbot building experience. And the best part is that Poly AI is available on Chrome, so you can take your chats across devices and even share your favorite characters with your friends. Every character that I've interacted with is so human-like. I genuinely enjoy having conversations with these characters, and it feels like the versions of them have been brought to real life. The download link is in the description and in my pinned comment. If you're ready to dive into the world of custom characters, download Poly AI and start creating today. It's all hypothetical, but here are the techniques with Shrine that could still possibly be unawakened and waiting for Itadori to manifest. We had already seen Yuji use dismantle, but we have never seen him use cleave. Actually, maybe it's possible, but it was definitely never stated. We're clearly shown that these slashes being directed with physical contact were dismantle, and normally that's a requirement for cleave whenever used by Sukuna. Manifesting this technique through Yuji Itadori could be responsible for Shrine appearing completely differently, but one other contributing factor could possibly be Yuji's cursed energy output. Despite landing multiple black flashes, his output was notably lower according to Sukuna, which possibly contributed to this technique appearing differently aside from interpretation. Baby Cleave did activate with physical contact before Yuji switched it to mainly activating dismantle. Regardless, this technique doesn't appear like Sukuna's, which often fillets its opponents on contact and far deeper than dismantle. Sukuna mentioned that despite dismantle not being as effective in slicing down Yuta and Yuji, cleave should reach far deeper in ripping through its targets. If this was cleave, which normally cuts deeper than dismantle, then it really is weird that Itadori would swap the technique mid-battle when one is seemingly worse when both of them require physical contact. It's also fair to note that we see Yuta Akotsu use the Sukuna style of cleave after copying the technique directly from Yuji Itadori, but we never see Yuji do anything like that himself. But then again, maybe it is just different with Yuji entirely, but comment down below what you think. Another Another extension of cleave that has only been seen through Sukuna is the cleave spiderweb. It's very short-lived and also only used once between the 260 chapters that we've known Sukuna throughout Jujutsu Kaisen, and you'll find this technique only used one time against Yuji and Maki. After incarnating into his brand new vessel, Megami Fushiguro, Sukuna's cursed energy output continued to decline when he had attempted to use his curse technique against his allies like Dismantle. In order to adapt to the situation, Sukuna then changed his curse technique's target and focused on the ground beneath him instead of Maki and Yuji directly. This then led to the activation of Cleave Spiderweb. If Sukuna's curse technique already normally doesn't really work against Megami's allies, then what about the ground? And that's exactly what Sukuna thinks before he tries using this attack and completely takes Maki and Yuji off their footing. This technique works just like Cleave and activates directly on physical contact, but instead of forming a grid-like shape and filleting and directly activating on top of his opponents, there's a spiderweb that's spread throughout the ground and rips through the floor. Maki then forcibly lost her footing from the crumbling ground beneath her, and despite her literally having precognition, Sukuna landed a jab straight to her face. Cleave spiderweb is definitely useful, but then again, never used by Itadori. Yuji's dismantles also have a completely different visual appearance and look completely different. Sukuna's slashes remain completely invisible to the naked eye, while Itadori's technique appears with guidelines and scissors like I've previously mentioned. Obviously, both of these techniques have their differences, but one key aspect that's seemingly missing entirely from Itadori's interpretation is the invisible and mainly the long-range aspect of Dismantle. Yuji did create his own binding vow for narrowing the effective range of the technique against Sukuna, and this was done to create even more damage to the barrier between the two souls of Megami Fushiguro and Ryomen Sukuna. We don't know the specifications made for this binding vow, and nothing is ever explicitly mentioned. Sukuna said that Itadori narrowed the effective range, and it's possible that he meant that Itadori aimed Dismantle more precisely between the barriers of the soul, or maybe this binding vow removed the capability from Dismantle to be launched at long range like normally. Maybe before making this binding vow, Yuji could have damaged the soul directly instead of the barrier in between. But now that the binding vow is made, Yuji is only striking the barrier between the two souls, while before he could have targeted both or something else entirely. Maybe the binding vow was that Yuji can only activate Dismantle on physical contact, therefore making the targeted range more precise and narrow just like Sukuna had mentioned. It's also possible that the binding vow itself is a mix between both interpretations, but overall we pretty much just have no idea. Overall, Itadori might be capable of sending slashes flying at his opponents like Sukuna, but something regarding either his mastery over Shrine, cursed energy output, technique interpretation, binding vow, or maybe some conscious decision he made against using the long-range aspect of this technique, it left this part of Dismantle completely unseen. These slashes being invisible are also missing within Yuji's interpretation of Shrine. Those guidelines and the seeming requirement for physical contact remove the element of surprise that adds the greater threat when defending yourself from Ryomen Sukuna. In normal circumstances, only Maki Zenin with precognition or Maharaga with adaptation can identify the trajectory of Dismantle, but clearly these dismantles can be tracked with the naked eye, considering that we can clearly see drawn out guidelines with even smaller scissors telling you exactly where he's going to be slicing. When broadening Dismantle and making this technique more long range, there's also the possibility of casting the world cutting slash. This technique that cut down Satoru Gojo isn't entirely different from a normal Dismantle. Obviously targeting space is one pretty big distinction, but that doesn't make this Dismantle fundamentally different than your ordinary slash. If we assume that Itadori's interpretation for Shrine does eventually create these same flying slashes, then he should be able to change the targeted area, but that might depend on other things that we don't exactly know currently. One major aspect of Shrine that we haven't seen from Itadori completely is the Divine Flame. It's Sukuna's black box from Shibuya that burned down Jogo and Maharaga to ashes and even stated within the fanbook to burn down enemies to their bone marrow. Divine Flame is activated after first using Dismantle followed up by Cleave. Both abilities work fundamentally with Shrine and are required to create the flame. This technically makes this an extension technique just like Hollow Purple that's created by combining both red and blue, except this is obviously with Cleave and Dismantle. These are described as the ingredients and they're necessary to open the doors to the furnace itself. This technique has been given multiple names since its first introduction, and some call it Fuga and others call it Furnace, but me myself, I call it the Divine Flame. If we assume that Itadori's interpretation doesn't hold him back from using Cleave and Dismantle like this, and it's only technique mastery, then in theory, eventually he should have the capacity for creating flames just like Sukuna. There's only one major drawback to these flames, and that it's despite their absurd firepower, these flames lack both speed and range, which makes sense considering that it's literally fire created from the friction by using Cleave and Dismantle. That last part is kinda headcanon about it being caused by the friction of Cleave and Dismantle, but it sounds cool, so we'll call it an educated guess. Sukuna solves this problem with range and speed by undertaking another binding vow. I've made an entire video explaining this technique technique in detail, and this part doesn't really relate to Itadori, so no need to explain. Just overall, he can't solve this issue without making another binding vow. Considering Sukuna pulled this off after only using this technique after expanding his domain expansion, maybe Itadori can make the same binding vow since he's now also achieved his own domain. Malevolent Shrine also created this explosive effect with Divine Flame that I've also explained in the video mentioned above, which happens to be an effect that Itadori's domain can't really replicate. Assuming Itadori can master Shrine with enough efficiency to one day be capable of heating up his own furnace like Sukuna, without Malevolent Shrine, he'd only likely be recreating something similar to the flames that we see during the Shibuya incident that burned down Jogo and not the ones that burned down Maharaga. There would be no thermobaric explosive effect, there would be no nuke, and there would be no explosion, it would just be fire. Naming one honorable mention would be Malevolent Shrine, but this didn't make the list considering domain expansions in general are designed more with the caster's personality ingrained into the core and fundamental concept of each domain. Innate domains that are brought into reality from the soul itself are found within the core of domain expansions. It's also obvious, but Itadori has awakened his own domain expansion, so why consider Malevolent Shrine this unawakened part of his arsenal when Yuji is pretty blatantly shown using his own domain? I would argue that manifesting domain expansion without Shrine being utilized would make this concept unawakened, but we have clearly seen Yuji Itadori's interpretation for Shrine when imbued inside domain expansion. You could argue that maybe this would be different when this domain is fully mastered because after all, Itadori did mention to Sukuna that this domain expansion is something that he quickly threw together and definitely not mastered. But if we dive any deeper into speculation, then we would be getting even deeper into theories and later headcanon than most of this video has already become. Considering the individualistic and personal aspect kept within every domain expansion, it's unclear what this hypothetical, truly mastered Shrine would actually be like when imbued inside a domain expansion. But nonetheless, it's still labeled here as an honorable mention as one of the techniques that Shrine had never fully manifested for whatever reason. I started off this video by saying that Yuji Itadori has two different curse techniques. I've already covered Shrine, so let's talk about his other curse technique, blood manipulation. We're briefly explained that he's now literally consumed his other brothers. Just like Choso, there's other curse wombs, and specifically numbers 4 through 9. These are the death paintings, and they were once created through Kenjaku's various devious acts, but they are now within Itadori, who himself is Kenjaku's own creation, which means that the death paintings and Yuji are now blood relatives. It's currently unknown, but Kenjaku at the time was Noritoshi Kamo. He had taken over the body of the head of the Kamo clan, who in the modern day passed down blood manipulation. Maybe Kenjaku's influence manifested blood manipulation, but that's not the point. Something manifested this curse technique within seemingly every different cursed womb death painting. Itadori has now consumed numbers 4 through 9, leading to his new curse technique, blood manipulation. Between the month before the Shinjuku Showdown and Satoru Gojo's unsealing, Yuji has gone under very serious training to master his brand new arsenal. Reverse curse technique and barrier techniques overall were mentioned, but he'd also been practicing manipulating his own blood. Yuji's main resource for learning more about his curse technique came through Kamo, as Choso wasn't really the best teacher, and apparently being 150 years old but also born last month makes you pretty bad at teaching. Since Itadori struggled while learning with Choso, this probably limited his knowledge and ability because he's now forced into training with Kamo. You shouldn't forget that Choso is literally on another level compared to Kamo, even aside from speed and power. Kamo seemed shocked, and he notes how exceptionally powerful even just charging up piercing blood was during Shibuya. Then when you combine those other techniques that we have never seen Kamo perform, and it's more than clear that Choso at least has a greater interpretation of blood manipulation when compared with Kamo. Aside from piercing blood and supernova, he doesn't perform any other blood manipulation based techniques. Itadori's limited skill and arsenal with this technique can seem that way because compared to Choso, he's only performed 2 techniques when there is an entire other section of 6 other techniques that we have never seen Yuji perform. Starting off with one of my favorite techniques, flowing red scale. This technique would have been massive for Itadori during the Shinjuku Showdown, and it's incredibly disappointing that we have never seen it being used before by Itadori. Flowing red scale controls the body temperature, pulse rate, and the number of red blood cells and overall blood composition, which is now under the caster's control. Essentially, this optimizes the user's physical condition by mastering their own blood. Increasing physical ability and even heightened perception are all attributes of mastering and activating the flowing red scale technique. A pretty good interaction for drawing a contrast between exactly how strong this makes the caster on activation would be looking at Megumi being able to defend himself against Kamo even when his vision is partially blocked by the falling debris from the ceiling. But when Kamo activated the flowing red scale technique, Megumi even notes that his cursed energy reinforcement was notably late, and he clearly has a harder time blocking Kamo's attacks. That case of heightened perception that I mentioned earlier happens when you're focusing flowing red scale into your extraocular muscles to raise the user's dynamic visual acuity. During this scene, we see Choso do this verbatim, but it's done to counter Noeya's high-speed movements movements with projection sorcery, which do inevitably fail, but they definitely help Choso in the moment massively. Naoya even flat out admits that Choso had adjusted to his curse technique and that he's making assumptions that Choso will counterattack when he's pre-planning his movements using his curse technique. When making those pre-planned movements with projection sorcery, bro was literally guessing that Choso will counterattack, and that's the only reason why he was able to readapt to what Choso had done. Obviously, the technique that amplifies the user's physical abilities would have been insane to give to Yuji Itadori out of nearly every other sorcerer, especially considering that Yuji's arsenal is predominantly based around physical attack power and martial arts. He wouldn't be capable of using both his shrine curse technique and blood manipulation at the same time, considering that using two curse techniques at the same time is pretty much impossible, unless you're like Kenjaku or any other special case with outside variables like Sukuna using Maharaga and Malevolent Shrine at the same time. However, you can't pretend like Itadori wouldn't massively benefit from increasing his physical abilities with Flowing Red Scale. His already insane physical power just using cursed energy manipulation alone would be even crazier. Convergence overall was something that Yuji wasn't really good at according to Choso. There was never any explicitly stated problem with convergence, and we just know that he's bad at using the technique. What convergence is essentially just compressing blood to be weaponized by the caster for different interpretations of blood manipulation. This not only created piercing blood, but tons of other techniques in the blood manipulation arsenal. Choso had used convergence to harden the blood around his body parts to form this strong armor. That protective layer even mitigated the damage done by Sukuna's very own Black Flash. There is kind of like a trade-off when you consider that hardening the body increases the risk of sudden thrombosis. There's a lot of risk going on, but it could be very rewarding in the right case scenario. Being bad at convergence definitely meant that most of the following abilities were never used by Itadori. These are all extension techniques that build off of compressing blood and convergence with other aspects of blood manipulation. Blood Meteorite is another extension within blood manipulation that Itadori never utilized. This attack was used on Itadori himself that pierced his gut and even had him considering the idea of losing and failing to free Gojo himself down in Shibuya. Instead, he resigned himself to die and promised himself that he doesn't need to be the one to complete the mission as long as Choso is defeated. It's pretty clear, but even in Shibuya, this technique was already seemingly lethal, but it's pretty obvious what made this technique so deadly. This technique is blood imbued and compressed to its very limit and then hardened and formed into a dense projectile that can then be launched at Choso's opponents. It's nothing like piercing blood when it comes to speed and power, but it's still incredibly deadly and also never used by Itadori. Blood Edge is another extension technique that's pretty similar to Blood Meteorite, but also very different. Instead of the user's blood being formed into a meteorite, it's formed into a single knife-shaped stream that can be used to stab and slash through opponents. Blood Edge's lethality can also be strengthened through shaping the blood and continuously rotating the blood at high speed instead of being hardened like Blood Meteorite, and both of these were never used by Itadori. Kamo had used Crimson Binding when engaging with Cursed Spirit Naoya, and it's pretty simple, but it's just like creating this rope-like net to instantly trap and bind your opponents. It's nothing really too complicated and not something super effective against Naoya. Another technique that would be more similar to piercing blood would be Slicing Exorcism. Its similarities come in the sense that both of these are ranged attacks using blood manipulation, but that would be mostly all. Both Choso and Kamo have used this technique before, making me wonder why this technique was never utilized by Itadori. Kamo had used this technique against Megami, and Choso had done the same against Gojo down in Shibuya's B5. This technique can be casted in two different forms. Based on what we're shown, Choso's interpretation is still far more advanced than Kamo's. Both the Destructo Disc variation and the laser/piercing blood style application can both be done by Choso. Neither hardening his body using convergence, increasing his physical ability using Flowing Red Scale, Blood Meteorite, Blood Edge, or even Slicing Exorcism were ever utilized by Itadori. Undoubtedly, some of the techniques in this video overall were definitely more useful than others. Not every technique here, and especially the ones using Shrine, are things that Itadori might perform in the future and just hasn't because of mastery. Like I've said earlier, curse techniques themselves just have their own interpretation, and depending on the sorcerer, they will manifest completely differently. Overall, this video isn't too serious, and I'm not claiming that Itadori would have gained any of these techniques after fulfilling some type of requirement. These are just the techniques that Itadori's curse techniques, Shrine, and blood manipulation definitely have the capacity for, but weren't utilized by Itadori either because he wasn't good enough at the technique, or maybe he just didn't think that there was any time these abilities could have been useful in the given scenario. Maybe his technique's interpretation just made these abilities impossible to use, but you get the idea. Thank you for watching.